Greetings and welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kochman, Director of Communications and Media with ABWE, with a first in the history of the Missions Podcast. We have the co-host of this show, Scott W. Dunford, pastor in Fremont, California, who is here in the ABWE studio.
I'm here. I can't believe it. I haven't been here in this studio before.
That's right. You've been in the other studio before you moved to the West Coast. That's right. Before we went to full video, when we were audio only, yes, that room did smell like dead mice.
So finally, I had the same voice filter as you, so you can probably hear my voice is much deeper than normal.
Right.
My face pipe looks better.
That's right. And now we can see that you are, in fact, wearing pants.
I'm not AI.
And you're not, well, debatable.
Yeah.
We'll see how this conversation goes. We'll judge that afterwards. It's so good to have you here.
It's good to be here.
And we are also here recording a series for ABWE too that's going to be released in the coming months. And so if you follow the resources that you can get from abwe.org, keep a lookout for a Foundations on Missions, Foundations on Christian Theology course and video series that'll be put out with that. Very excited for that. This is, in some ways, it's going to be basic for some people in our audience because it is the foundations of what we believe. The problem is there's so much, can I say this, anti-intellectualism in evangelicalism and in the missions world.
Yeah.
And so just the opportunity to talk through why we believe this message that we've been called to share with the nations.
Right. No, I think it's going to be foundational, if I can use that word.
It's going to be foundational. Right? It's going to be fundational.
So, yeah, I think that's super important. And we recognize as our culture gets busier and busier, we need to make more time to stop and study and think through why we believe what we believe. And the faith that's been delivered to us, are we holding that and passing it along faithfully? So I think this will be a very welcome resource, not only for our missionaries, but hopefully it'll be something useful for the church too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're also here to create some content for the Missions Podcast while we have you out here. And so I'd like to dive into a spicy topic. How would you like to dive into something spicy today?
Let's do it.
All right. Of course, do we ever not?
Let's just keep it at medium, maybe.
Medium. All right. That sounds good.
Comic level.
Yeah, that's good. No ghost peppers here.
Right. For Oppenheimer.
Let's talk about strategic retreat. Let's talk about this idea, and I'll set this up a little bit, give some background. Let's talk about this idea that Christians should consider the strategy of pulling out of places that are very hostile to the Christian faith and even more broadly to conservative policy, to the things that kind of make for the good life, right? This started several weeks ago on Twitter, so we don't need to rehash everything, but just to give a little bit of a background, there's a pastor who was in California, now in Texas, put out a book called Fighting by Fleeing. That's Pastor Joel Webbon. And he did an interview on the Steve Deace show on The Blaze, which gained a lot of attention on both sides, positive and negative. And his essential premise is that people should consider, and pastors and churches and Christians should consider doing what he did, which was leaving your home state of California. Now you are on a mission field, so you're not under any pretenses that California is some sort of a bastion of Christendom, right? Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say.
Talk to me briefly, just by way of setup for some of this, how you've approached your calling to serve there in a more difficult place as far as seeing hearts turning to the gospel sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, there's no question, especially where I live in the Bay Area. My church is in San Mateo, California, on the peninsula, about 20 minutes south of San Francisco. And churches are small, they're aging, they're struggling. And yet I can't think of a better place to do ministry because of how I view the calling of the Christian church, which is to see one of the differences between me and that pastor, what's his name again? Webbon, is that I don't think Texas is Christian either. I don't.
Sure.
I think that the job, though, of the church that Christ gave to us was to go into all the world, preach the gospel, establish these little bastions of kingdom in the middle of hostile territory, pushing back the darkness where we are. And so what better place for Christians to be, I think, than in places that are still under domination by the last final throes of Satan on this earth.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate the way that you're articulating that. I'm hearing hints of spiritual warfare and past conversations that we've had in there.
Yes.
Because whether you live in Pennsylvania or Texas or Florida or California or China, it's possible to have a defeatist mentality. It's possible to say, I'm just here to kind of white knuckle it until I get to heaven. My church is just here to take souls to heaven. We don't want to be pushing back on the darkness. And so even to hear you say, like, wherever I am, I'm going to be pushing back on the darkness and advancing the kingdom in these little outposts everywhere. That's a philosophy that I think that we can agree that it's biblical.
Right. Yeah, I strongly believe that. And so when I hear of someone advocating, and I know of a church really close to me, it's not where this man was pastoring, but another pastor that would be probably in our circles. I think, he would likely be the kind of person that would probably tune into the Missions podcast, possibly. Got up in front of his church one Sunday, a church that in the Bay Area was a thriving church of 150 people, which would be considered
for the Bay Area,
a pretty good sized church.
Yeah.
Very diverse church, very solid biblically, a church that's very solid biblically, and got up and resigned and just trashed, like, how can we live in this horrible place, and up and moved his family and moved to someplace more accommodating to, his version of cultural Christianity. And it left a devastating wake, because here is this growing body of believers that just lost their pastor because of this, I think, defeatist mentality, which is often coming from people who hold to an optimistic eschatology.
Which Webbon does.
Yeah, which is, in my mind, what he's describing is don't you still believe the gospel can change things? That's what I would question him. Like, why not stay and keep seeing the gospel grow, like that little mustard seed that's planted and growing and expanding in that little place? Why did you leave?
Yeah. Here's where I think we can dive deeper into this a little bit. So what happened after that initial interview with Webbon is the internet ran with it, Twitter ran with it, as things go. And a lot of pastors and people in our circles were jumping into the conversation saying, well, hang on, Christians shouldn't be willing to leave certain places, because every Christian is called to stick it out as a missionary. Every Christian is a missionary.
Right.
I didn't get really involved in the conversation online other than to log on once or twice and to sort of say, brothers, the way around this theological pickle is not to say that every Christian is a missionary, right? And I don't hold that, and you don't hold that. Is every Christian called to be a light? Yes. Is every Christian called to, in some shape or form or fashion, do the work of an evangelist? Yes. But just as not every Christian is a pastor,
right,
not every Christian is a missionary either. And so there's distinctions and differences there. And so here's what I understand the position of Webbon and people like him to be. And this is a position which personally I'm willing to consent to as far as it goes, but based on how I'm articulating and sharing it. I haven't read the book. My understanding is that he's not critiquing you. He's not critiquing people that are pastoring in these hard places,
right,
have a clear calling, that have a clear missionary calling in some of these places. He seems to be critiquing the average complacent person who's not involved in their community, not involved in their school board, not involved in their church or in outreach or in local evangelism or in any of those sorts of things, but maybe because of some of the books they've read, the voices that they've been exposed to, they've latched onto this language of being missional, and they've sort of clung to that as an excuse, maybe for inaction. Well, I'm on mission here, but we all know how easy it is to say, hey, I'm on mission here, and then that turns into I'm having fewer and fewer, and eventually I'm having no gospel conversations on a consistent basis. And to that person, the challenge is, listen, where you live, you can do that to the glory of God.
Right.
Whatever you eat or drink, wherever you live, right? These are areas of wisdom and prudence and Christian liberty. But do the math. If you're not ministering, if you're not having any kind of a visible kingdom investment where you are, I don't even want to say impact, because impact assumes an output goal. We're not responsible for the outcome. God is responsible for outcomes. We're responsible for the input, right? Our faithfulness. If you're not engaged in those intentional, direct, missional inputs, then maybe your presence is a net negative. maybe the negative as far as what your tax dollars are funding, as far as godless policies, killing of the unborn, all sorts of injustice happening in your community, your state, the worldview to which your children may be exposed. I think there's a critical importance here to distinguish the responsibilities and duties of parents, right? Especially of young children whose worldviews are still forming and thinking about what are they being exposed to through neighbors, friends, through education. Even thinking about financially, your stewardship, how much money is going towards housing and these various things that could go to other kingdom causes, right? And I think the challenge is to say to that type of a person, do the math. If your missionary contribution where you live outweighs some of those negatives of participating in that godless area, then by all means stay put. If you're someone who's just saying that you're about the work of mission, but you're not involved in those ways, and you're not caring for an elderly parent or have some other obligation or calling in life that anchors you to that place, the challenge would be to say, couldn't you do more for the kingdom? If nothing else changed in your life, at least being a part of a community that's more favorable to the advance of the gospel and plugging in some very simple ways into that community, whether it's through voting, whether it's through your church involvement, some of those types of things. That's what I understand the position to be. How would you want to interact with that? How does that strike you as a pastor who's doing the hard thing, who is there trying to make disciples in a godless place?
Yeah. I mean, in the interview that we watched, I didn't read the book either.
Yeah.
I don't plan on reading the book. It was interesting to me, and I think it exposed a different kind of idol, and you may disagree with this, in that so much of the talk was about politics. Well, you know what would happen if this small percentage moved from California to Pennsylvania, Florida, Ohio, Michigan, the battleground states, right? And I was like, since when did gospel strategy get connected to whether we're voting red or blue? And that, to me, that's exposing a certain kind of idol that I would be very nervous about. And one, where does that go? I mean, I've lived long enough to see states that were solidly red turn blue and blue states turn purple. And, this happens a lot. It can be constantly moving to where we think we can have the most bang for our buck vote wise. And this is overly simplistic probably, but I just don't see that being at all a concern of Paul, of our kind of like our prototypical New Testament missionary. Now granted, he's living in a different world. There was...
Well, yeah, let me hone in on that. Yeah, there's a lot of things that weren't a concern of. I mean, Paul wasn't married. Paul didn't have children.
Yeah.
Paul didn't live under a political system in which he was entrusted with voting rights, right? And all sorts of things, a Christian society to steward and to conserve. He didn't have really any of that, right? He was a first generation Christian, we would say now.
Right. But I think Jesus, and we might have a discussion about this, maybe it's opening a can of worms, but Jesus wasn't, my kingdom's not of this world, right? He wasn't thinking about, hey, how do we establish a new political order here? And when Paul's reaching the churches, you don't see any hint of, hey, let's all get in a boat somewhere and go to the new world and reestablish someplace where we could all be Christians apart from the lost. In fact, when Peter, I'm thinking about First Peter now, which is obviously not Paul. Peter's talking to them about, hey, how do you live in a pagan world? How do you honor the emperor while also living as a new people of God, a new citizenship, a kingdom of priests, a new temple? He's talking about how do you live in this really pagan world as set apart to God in such a way that the world around you sees, your lifestyle and turns to God. I think that gets more to the heart of what Jesus was talking about when he says, talking about the city on a hill where men may see your good works and glorify our Father which is in heaven. And so that's where I just didn't see the conversation going. It seemed to be very much about where we can get the most political impact, which I don't know that if red gets all the political impact they want, it's going to be that much more godly.
Sure.
And there are some things clearly that there's some areas that they emphasize certain things that the blue doesn't, vice versa sometimes. But so clearly, like obviously I want laws that protect the unborn. I want laws that are just. I want laws that are good. And of course we should care about those things as Christians. But should that be our driving motivation as far as where we move, especially if God's placed you in a place to up and move, unless there's a special call from the Lord there's lots of good reasons to leave a place. But is that a good reason to leave a place? That's a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there that we can address and unpack. But first of all, what I would seek to do is legitimize Christians making these strategic decisions and having conversations like this. Because what I hear is one side sort of simplistically wanting to say, no, every Christian is a missionary. Therefore, you have to, and maybe there's an appeal to Paul here, each should remain in the state in which he was called. But what I want to say is Christians are free to not only make these strategic decisions for a variety of motivations, and all of these loves have to be rightly ordered, right? So obviously loyalty to the Lord and to his mission, to the advance of the gospel, commitment to a local church. Also commitment to one's body politic and to the state and to government and the good of others around you, which part of that does happen through voting and through policy. Even though we live in such a crazy time, there have been a few wins, right? You know, the overturning of Roe. I mean, there's certain ways in which we can love our neighbors by the way that we vote. Loyalty to one's family and concern for them, love for relatives and concern for them. And so I think we need to legitimize the wisdom that Christians use in making those sorts of decisions. I had a conversation with a pastor several weeks ago who pastors in Midtown Manhattan. So not exactly a red district. And he was sad, he was grieved that so many were leaving his church in Manhattan to go and move to more, not only red states, but rural areas where there's more established churches. And part of the feeling that I had in the conversation, of course, I didn't share all of this with him at the time, but as I'm listening to him, I could feel that there's maybe a bitterness there of, here I am trying to faithfully shepherd these sheep. And if you're a shepherd that the Lord has called to lead these sheep that are in kind of a brown, dry, patchy area of pasture, right? And yet there's a few sheep that you can send to greener pasture, right? Where they're not paying absolutely through the nose, living in a very dangerous area where they can actually move off and establish wealth that can be used for the kingdom, for the advance of missions, where they can maybe have better educational options for their children, to disciple their children, to send them off as arrows into the world on mission, right? All sorts of kingdom objectives in that move. As a shepherd, I would want to celebrate if I could send a few sheep off in that way and not be bitter. And I heard some bitterness on his part as a result of that. And I think that's part of what led to the heat over this decision. When I look at Scripture, I see Old and New Testament shades of difference and examples of times that people can move strategically and not just for directly missionary objectives. I think you're absolutely right that the advance of the gospel is first. Number one, Jesus is Lord. That is our number one loyalty. But there's a difference between sort of being a Jonah and being a Lot, right? And you can say, well, that's Old Testament. In the New Testament as well, there's times when the Christians are sticking it out in very hard places. There's other times where Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation, or in Luke, when you see Jerusalem encamped by her enemies, flee, right? There's New Testament examples of fleeing for spiritual and physical reasons from a certain location as well. But when I look at Jonah and Lot, Jonah didn't want to do the hard thing in the hard place and carry good news, right? He wanted to do something easy, and the Lord confronted him for that as well. But then you also have folks like Lot, who maybe had pietistic reasons they thought that they could tough it out in a certain place. And there are places, and this isn't for us to know, this is the mind of God. We don't know the decree of God, but there's sometimes when a move of the Spirit isn't coming anytime soon. And does the little mustard seed, right, penetrate the whole soil and grow into this massive tree? Doesn't the yeast, the leaven, permeate the whole lump and cause it all to rise? Well, yes, but not in the same place at the same time at the same rate. In the book of Acts, you see all of the believers fleeing, and that's how the first missionary movement comes to Antioch. You have people fleeing from Crete and from other places and going to Antioch, and from there, Barnabas is sent as a missionary actually back to Crete. So the Lord cares about Crete,
Right.
but there's a long-term strategy to do that through. Maybe we need to pull out, strategically retreat. We need to sort of build churches, institutions, households, from which as a launching point for further mission to affect political things on one level, but for ministry and for kingdom objectives as too. You have Lot, though, who didn't want to leave, right? And the Lord confronted him for that. And so there was a mixture of motives here. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Let me read a quote for you. And how would you deal with this quote? Now, I'll warn you with this quote. I could not find primary source attestation to this quote, okay? So this is attributed on the internet to William Carey. Seems like something that he might have said because it's consistent with some of his other writings, but I couldn't find for sure that he said it, and if so, where, okay? So this is William Carey. He said this, that he wanted to, it's a very short quote, to say, wrong quote. He wanted to save England by leaving it. And now the fuller quote, which we do have, this is from the Puritan Hope. This is, Ian Murray quotes this as well. He talks about how Europe's example was 1,000 times worse than the superstitions of Hinduism. Okay, so his heart is for India. He sees the spiritual collapse in India, and he thought that he could save England by leaving it. We don't know what he meant by that, if indeed he said it. What would you do with that sentiment? Is there a time where, hey, because I love Crete or because I love England, maybe I can do it spiritual good by leaving temporarily?
So you're saying leave Texas to come to California? Oh, I agree with that. I agree with that.
There's plenty of nonsense in Texas.
I can only speculate on what William Carey or Pseudo-William, but it does sound like something William Carey would say.
Pseudo-William.
Right? It does sound like something William Carey would say. I think if I'm guessing what his motivation was in saying that, I would guess that he's saying, by me leaving, it's stirring up a passion and a heart for pagan places. It wasn't easy for William Carey in India, but you notice once Indian believers are coming to Jesus, he didn't say, let's all move to England. Let's get back to Christendom. That's not what he was saying.
No, he wanted to take Christendom to India.
Right. And it's, or at least Christianity, we can discuss Christendom.
Sure.
Probably William Carey wanted to bring Christendom too. But
he was a Baptist.
Yes. Yeah.
Baptist Christendom.
Yeah. But also, I lost my train.
Well, that's fine, because you know what? I found the actual quote. Again, the one that, I don't know the source, to save England from spiritual collapse. Those are the exact words, okay? So here's maybe how I would attempt to answer this. This is in an article. If it's out by the time we post the show, we'll put this in the show notes. So what could that have meant? Are there any benefits to occasional strategic retreat? The three reasons I would give. So push back on these. I want to hear your opinion. Number one, to stir jealousy. So the Apostle Paul in Romans, right? He wished he could be cut off from Christ, Romans 9:3, for the sake of his kinsmen according to the flesh. He loved the Jews so much he was willing to even lose his salvation over them if such a thing were possible, which of course it is not. And yet in Romans 11, his strategy was to magnify his ministry to the Gentiles in order to provoke them, the Jews, to jealousy. So is there a way to provoke the folks at home? Prophets never welcome in their hometown.
Right.
To provoke the people back home by having a ministry elsewhere. That's one idea. Another idea is to catalyze revival. David Livingston famously said, the best diet for a sick church is a missionary diet, right? So by leaving a hard place or sending someone elsewhere, does that create a certain stirring right back home to say, like, we should maybe take our own missional commitment a little bit more seriously as we see people go elsewhere? And then the third potential reason that strategic retreat or sending might be strategic is to save future senders. And that's the example of, I think I said Crete earlier, Cyprus, right? Where you see that Christians who were Jews from Cyprus who were converted in the first wave of persecution following Stephen's martyrdom, they leave Cyprus. And then it's Barnabas, who's from Cyprus, that goes back there with the gospel in the first missionary trip in Acts 13. So I think there's ways that maybe you can leave your own nation to save it. But the goal is God
Right.
and love and loyalty to Him, and nations second.
I'd like to say a couple things.
Yeah.
One is, while I reject what this pastor's saying as a strategy, it doesn't mean individually there's not reasons to leave a place.
Okay.
Be really clear about that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's one thing for me to say to my congregation, hey, we're out, let's go to Tennessee, or, wherever you might think Christendom is flourishing. I don't see it in America. But if you want to suggest that there is a place, okay, I would reject that as a strategy. But that doesn't mean that you might come to me as a congregant and say, I've got this reason why I feel like we need to move. That would be something I think it would be very good to sit down with your pastor, your church leadership, wrestle through that together.
Yeah.
And there could be very good reasons. We had a sweet lady in our church, a huge part of our ministry, really encouraging person, and her husband worked for Google and
Good Christian company.
They owned a house though in South Carolina. They have all their family in South Carolina, and when they got a chance to work from home, instead of losing all the money, they were losing so much money living in California. They could go live near their family, have faithful ministry there. They left with full blessing, right? Like that made so much sense. That was a good reason, I feel like, to leave, and she handled it so wisely in the process. But I could also imagine as a pastor, imagining that pastor in Manhattan that you described, if you're trying to faithfully minister in that place and you got just people hemorrhaging all the time because, they get frustrated by this or that or the other, like how are you going to make progress? And that can be very, very discouraging.
Oh, absolutely.
So just to answer,
pastoral ministry is already so discouraging.
It is.
Too.
So, I just want to address the fact that I don't think there's no good reason to leave. There's lots of good reasons to leave, family is an important part of that, and knowing your family, maybe your children are struggling in that place. And that's a good discussion to have with your church leaders, and maybe you need to move, and I could imagine that happening. Retirees in difficult
places. Let's put a
places.
footnote there because I want to come back to something.
Yeah. The other part of it though, I would take all those arguments and flip them the other way. So if we were looking at the children of Israel as the so-called people of God, there wasn't, we never would call that Christendom, but they definitely viewed themselves as God's people. And now they're looking over and saying this pagan land, like Antioch wasn't Christian. Ephesus wasn't Christian. Corinth wasn't Christian.
Sure.
Philippi wasn't Christian. They're seeing these places come to God. That is stirring them up. I would argue to those places that think they're Christian because they got big mega churches, pastored by Joel Osteen, that they would look to a place like California and say, look at the lost that are coming.
Yeah.
Look at that Hindu young man who just got baptized. Look at this Muslim young woman who just came to Christ. Like, why aren't we seeing that kind of conversion, that their hearts would be stirred toward jealousy? So I would flip it on its head and say, what we're seeing there isn't like a retreat. We aren't seeing like Christians being stirred to jealousy. In Paul's example there, he was saying the salvation of the pagan lands should cause so-called people of God to be returned to God.
Yeah. Well, there's actually, there's multiple things there that I think are helpful to distinguish. Well, I said we wanted to return to something that you said. You said individuals are free to make those choices.
Yeah.
Maybe the question I'd throw at you, and maybe don't answer it yet. I think what I would push back and say is, well, can a group of individuals make that choice? Can a group of individuals that covenant together as a church make that choice to together say, hey, we're in Canada, and right now, if we refuse to affirm, our child's gender identity, that child could be taken from us, and so we're going to move elsewhere where our children aren't at risk, right? For the sake of continuing to live faithfully in all of these other areas of life, including mission. Something I want to return to, though, this can be another conversation, and I think it should be another conversation. Is there a part of this, Scott, where are we idolizing the idea of mission? Are we idolizing the idea of evangelism? This came up last year when we were talking to Chad Vegas at the Radius Conference. We didn't get too deep into it, but I do think, really, for my position, for your position, sure, politics can be idolized. So can missions and evangelism be idolized, right? So can family. We can make an idol out of anything. The human heart is a perpetual forgery of idols, John Calvin said. But is there a risk that we, in our particular sort of tribe, the average listener to the Missions podcast, makes an idol out of the idea of being a missional person, right? Where that can become an overriding thing to the detriment of loving my neighbor in other civic ways, to the detriment of loving my children with the best education possible, to the detriment of loving my church well, even though some of them might get a better job and move off, and it's for the good of their family and even maybe for their spiritual good long term in some different ways. I'm asking it kind of facetiously because I think we both agree that that can be an idol. And I think as shepherds and as pastors, as we're dealing with individual situations, we would want to help people walk through those decisions on an individual level, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a danger of, and this is probably a whole nother discussion, right? But there's a danger of like that adrenaline rush of going to the hard place, and maybe even a little bit of like, I want to be somebody, I want a name, yeah. I mean, not that we could ever articulate it that way.
Well, okay, friend of the show, we had him on. I don't think you were on the interview. Chase Davis, who's in Colorado,
yeah,
former Acts 29 pastor. He thought he was really cool doing the missional thing, wearing the skinny jeans, doing it all in Boulder, Colorado.
Yeah,
and he kind of had a wake up experience where he realized it wasn't going to be that easy.
Right. It's not easy, but I also think the idea of like everyone being missionaries in California, for instance, of course. I wouldn't call the church members that are there, that are native Californians and say you're missionaries here in that sense. They're not in that Pauline sense. Yeah, we've talked about this a lot. Like, and I'm not going to quibble when someone's saying I'm going to be a missionary every day. Yes, we quibble about it in the missiological sense, but living intentionally, that's what we want people to do.
Yeah.
But there is a difference. I mean, I did move out to California for the purpose of ministry. Like I have a mentality about it, but also, I mean, you mentioned this off camera that, Paul's idea of live in the state you were called, remain in the state you were called, that, hey, there are believers here. They need to be focused. We need to stir their hearts up to be thinking intentionally. Like there was a time, and this is where I'm getting a little concerned, very concerned. If we start chasing the political tale of what I agree with right now, that's a fickle chase.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't very long ago that California was the conservative bastion.
That's right.
And a place like Pennsylvania would have been a very liberal bastion.
On Pennsylvania, and this is something I was going to mention earlier, Pennsylvania is still fairly liberal.
Sure.
In a lot of places, but also I think the strategy of moving to some of these other places, just to give that side of the argument some credit, I don't think anyone's saying that Texas is a Christian state. Rather, I think it's just saying maybe the spirit of the age hasn't progressed quite as far in some areas here, and maybe there's a chance to put more points on the board. I think that's the argument. I don't want to accuse people of saying that Texas is a Christian republic or something.
And I just, you and I just disagree about that, I think. I mean, I don't know how much you hold to that. I just disagree with that idea. But because I think making political movement is, it ends up being a losing game, I think. I don't think you can ever come out of the winning side. I mean, and we don't need to go into that
deeply.
deeply.
Agree that the gospel is the answer.
The gospel.
Politics is downstream from culture. Culture is downstream from cultus, religion. Right. Religion is what's at the headwaters.
Right. And you think about these churches that I've been involved with in California, in the Bay Area, 50 years ago when they were planted, or 75 years ago in the case of Western Hills Church, 75 years ago it was planted by people from the Christian parts of America that moved out there and started these Baptist churches. Mm-hmm. And now here we are 75 years later and going, where are the people? Well, some of them were faithful in evangelizing their neighborhoods, but also new nations came in, like Hindus, Chinese.
And here's something that I also want to say, which I think you'll resonate with. This is what I want to say to challenge the more, I guess, conservative side of the argument, or whoever you would point to. But to those that are maybe more on my side of this conversation, if you're very discouraged about the state of our nation, about the state of the political climate, all those sorts of things, if you're a Christian and you're concerned for the morality of things that's happening, you should be concerned. You should love your nation. Don't take the black pill. Don't lose hope, because look at how God is saving Afghans in the Bay Area. Look at how God is saving people in China, both in the underground church and here in the States.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many examples that you can point to. And you can grieve the loss of certain things in our culture and society, but look at the kingdom from a global perspective, not purely a your state level perspective. Just rejoice that the kingdom of God is exploding outside of the West.
Yeah.
And still progressing on in parts of the West as well. God is going to be glorified among the nations. I mean, that's a beautiful thing. Now, how does that affect, where I live? Honestly, it's hard to really act globally, right? Think locally, think globally, act locally. Like that's kind of a contrived thing. Like, can I really know everything that's happening in the world? Nobody has the brain power to wrap their minds around all of that, but I can rejoice in that and I can praise God for that. And I shouldn't lose hope because of that either.
And I think there's a benefit at times, and this is going to sound like I'm saying put your head in the sand, and I'm not. I do read the news. Like I know there's bad things happening around me, but also, but I detach. Some people are wondering where I went on Twitter. I'm not following all the political Twitter. I mean, I look at the sports stuff once in a while.
Do you miss it?
Right? I don't miss it.
I'm sure you don't.
You turn off the news go on a news fast for a while, or just shut off your social media that's focusing on these things. Stop being so angry about what's happening around you, and start looking more closely at what's happening in your community. I mean, I'm just thinking this last week. The Arabic congregation I'm connected to, they had 2 baptisms of Muslim background believers coming to Jesus. In the last year, we had a former Hindu come to Jesus and be baptized. I'm talking to Muslim background believers, people who did not know the gospel previously, but because they live where they live and there's still gospel pockets of proclamation.
And people are living faithfully on mission. They're not just content like Lot in Sodom.
Right. And so if you're living discontently, and you're living kind of like a marginal Christian life in a place like California, I don't think moving to Texas is going to suddenly spark your spiritual appetite.
Now that's a good point. So the real problem there is, could you maybe do some more good by voting differently elsewhere? Maybe, but really you should also just be faithful.
Yeah.
Right. That's the real problem there. That's a great point.
Right. I know there's some out there who say, let's just outpopulate them. I would say, let's out-evangelize them. I believe, and I know you do too, because you're a faithful witness. I admire the way you share the gospel. Let's be faithful to evangelism. Let's be faithful to prayer. Before we pack up the moving truck for that reason, let's really pray.
Have you tried?
Right. Let's really
have you tried?
Get invested in our community.
There might be a date and time to move, but have you tried? That's fair.
I'm thinking about this week. My parents are going to be moving in their moving truck and leaving California and moving back to Michigan. And it's not because of mission. It's because they can't afford to live there anymore.
Right.
That's a reality. It is a sad reality.
But that is part of mission.
But
that's the thing.
Same thing with the persecution you mentioned earlier. They were when they were persecuted in Jerusalem, they went to Antioch and these other places. They weren't leaving, a pagan place for a Christian place. They were fleeing a persecution situation. Yeah. And this isn't persecution. This isn't, although the ridiculous taxes and the skyrocketing costs of living might be a type of persecution. I don't know. But there is a reality that sometimes we have to move. And I don't think we should I don't want to put a guilt trip on people listening.
Right.
I had to leave. I wanted to be closer to my grandkids. There might be very, very good reasons why you did that. But I also would say, boy, like I hope my people, if they're listening to this, don't leave simply because it'd be easier somewhere else. Like, hey, commit to the cause. Like, yeah, missionary in that formal sense, but you are placed here by God in a unique place. Let's impact our communities for Jesus.
And one of the ways that we impact our communities, number one, God's plan is through the local church. Something that needs to be brought into this conversation. If you're living in a red or a blue state, in a godless or a godly place or a culturally Christian place, what have you. But if you're not connected with a godly, Christ-centered, Bible expositing church, fix that first.
Yeah.
Better to be a part of a sound church in a dark place than part of no church in a place that has somewhat more light. That's number one. Get plugged into your church. Don't just be missional in this sort of lone gun ranger sort of sense, and I'm having people over for dinner or talking to my neighbors. That's fine. Do that in the life of the church, because when Jesus says, make disciples of all nations by knocking on doors and having people over for dinner, by baptizing and teaching them. Baptism, teaching, that happens in the context, number one, of the local church. right? And outside that on the mission field too, but number one, that is a calling to plant churches and to be about church life. That's number one. Number two is, I think, part of how the gospel advances in all of these places is not only through the church gathered, but through the church scattered in that community.
Yeah.
Schools, Christian businesses.
Right.
Can you establish a pocket of resistance, can I say, right? A connection of a seminary, like connections of different institutions that together can advance the kingdom all 7 days of the week.
And I would say, to Christians that are living in a place that maybe you're in a big church, and you feel like I've got a good Christian bubble, and maybe you wish you had more unsafe friends and you don't have them. I'd say, be praying for these Christians that are living in these places, not just in places like California, obviously. Like California compared to Pakistan or India is Christendom. These are, we do have churches. There's several churches in my own city, that the pastors are good, faithful people. And I would say the Christians that I know in California are committed, I
don't know any lukewarm Christians from California. I'm not saying there aren't any.
Yeah.
But all of the Christians, and I know several people in California, my good friend Chad Vegas, right? Yeah. Our mutual friend Steve Meister.
Yeah.
They are solid. You don't have the luxury of being lukewarm.
Well, when I think of my son, was just sharing this story when he first moved to California, of being in a class, and most of his classmates were Hindus, and they found out he was a Christian, and there was a little bit of it. They weren't trying to be totally mean. There was significant bullying about him being a Christian. They were calling, Mary a whore and these kind of things.
Do we have to bleep that? I don't know. Okay, keep going.
This is reality. And he shared with me, this is now several years ago, just shared with me this last week. It just that was difficult, right? That was something he did not face, living in a Catholic dominated area or a Baptist dominated area. Mm-hmm. No one would be bold enough to say that about Mary, and yet it was a defining moment for him where he had to say, this is my faith. I love Jesus. And cause him to be more serious about his faith in a significant way. So pray for these people, and maybe God would be leading you to come, hey, let's be part of a small little church replant, or a revitalization, and come be part of that if God opens that door. Don't just shut it down.
And in fact, because you're here on the East Coast, you're moving back to Pennsylvania, right? You're here in the studio because...
No, Al.
Oh.
No.
Okay.
No. And it would have been, we went through a transition recently, and it would have been easy to, in some ways, to just move. And yet we felt still like we had a ministry that God had called us to in the Bay Area, and we weren't ready to leave that. Even though it's difficult. Financially, it's very difficult.
Yeah.
Rent is $4,000 for a small duplex, it's not cheap, but I do think that if God's leading you that way and calling you that way, that it's a great place to do ministry. It's freeing to live in a place where to be a Christian means something.
But be a missionary, right? Do ministry in some way.
Follow Jesus.
Don't be complacent.
Make disciples.
Don't be complacent, right? Don't slouch towards Gomorrah.
No.
Right? Don't be Lot in Sodom. If you're going to be in Nineveh, be Jonah in Nineveh.
Right, but don't be Lot and Sodom in Austin, Texas, or Dallas either. Don't just join a mega church and just slouch your way. Right. Hopefully get into heaven.
That's right. Don't be complacent in Florida and say, but at least I'm in Florida. But you're not actually putting points on the board for the kingdom. I think what we're saying at the end of this is pray as a family, as a church, about where the Lord would put you. Mission is a factor. So is family, so are finance, all these other things, right? So is wisdom. God gives us freedom. Praise God, He gives us freedom, right, to choose. But take inventory of your life. Are you living intentionally? Wherever you are you putting points on the board to the best of your ability, long obedience in the same direction, right? Are you being faithful to the Lord, or are you going with the cultural flow? I think that's a great place to end it. This is fun.
It is.
Good to be reunited, my good friend.
Yes.
So we want to hear what you think. We know this is a deep and intricate topic. We'd be really interested, I think, in getting a couple listener letters, maybe about this topic, honestly. Maybe we'll even read some in our next recording if we get some. So, Email alex@missionspodcast.com or email scott@missionspodcast.com if you want to share why Alex is so wrong about all of this. Either way, but he'll forward it to me, so we'll be fine.
Of course, I'll gloat a little.
Of course, that's right. But remember, if this show has encouraged you or at least sharpened you or your thinking in some way, hopefully it has, by God's grace, remember to leave us a positive rating and review. If you're watching us on YouTube, remember to destroy the subscribe button. Help this channel grow. Leave a comment. That helps the algorithm. That's really how this content can get out and be a blessing to more people. We're trying to help more people wherever they are live on mission.
Even if you only listen, still just go to the YouTube channel just to subscribe to help.
That's right. Inflate our egos and our view counts and all those sorts of things.
We want to get it out there.
And by the way, we know it now. It's not many of you, but some of you have taken that step to support the show too. Thank you to those who have. missionspodcast.com/support. This is a part of the ABWE ministry. We want to steward our resources well. And every time that you give a generous gift of that nature, it helps us do things like capture exclusive interviews at Radius conferences or bring you here into the studio. Give us more time together, more time to research, all sorts of things like that. And we appreciate those of you who've partnered with the Missions Podcast and with ABWE in that way. Remember, the Missions Podcast is a ministry of ABWE. To learn more, go to abwe.org. And until our next conversation, thanks for listening, and stay where you are or move, whichever you please. Thanks. Bye-bye.